about benchmarks. The meeting is now being recorded, so that'll be shared around afterward as well. Again, welcome. I'm Teresa Bugeaud. I am the Director of Data Analytics and M+R, and I am joined today by Matt Derby, who's Senior Vice President at M+R, and Paul DiGiorgio from Rally. I'll let Paul introduce himself in a couple of slides. If you haven't seen it yet, the full study, including what we will discuss here today, can be found at mrbenchmarks.com/UK. And if you have any questions as we go along today, feel free to type them in the chat. We do have a lot of people on the call, so everyone is muted, but we'll be keeping an eye on the chat as we go. We'll try to answer any urgent questions as they pop up to make sure things are, that we clarify things as we go, but we'll probably hold most questions for the end because we have a lot of time for questions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with M+R, we are a US agency that works with nonprofits to advance their missions. We design strategies, develop creative, and process a lot of data. We are deep in this work every day, and benchmarks is a chance for us to step back a bit. Even better, it's a chance to share what we're seeing with the broader nonprofit community so that we can understand what's happening and move our industry forward. So this year is our 15th benchmarks report. A few months ago, we released that, and I'll refer to that as we go through this as the global benchmarks report, just to make sure we can distinguish between them. That typically includes mostly US-based nonprofits, but this is our first year doing a UK-focused report, and we're really excited to have it out in the world. We're also really excited to partner with Rally on this year. And now I will let Paul tell you more about Rally and why we decided to do this.
Brilliant. Hello, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, and I imagine that's quite a lot of you, I'm Paul, and I'm the founder of Rally. I'll tell you a little bit about Rally, and then I'll talk about why we're doing the study and why we're so excited to be doing the study with M+R this year's. So like I say, I'm the founder of Rally, and basically after years of working at traditional agencies, I wanted to found something which was a little bit different. So it's founded as a hub or a collective, which means we sit with an incredible network of activists, strategists, campaigners, fundraisers, creatives, and communicators who we then collaborate with to create teams to match up to client problems. We have this fundamental belief that people have power, and helping people unlock their power is key to driving change. So we only work with organizations who are fighting for a fairer, healthier, safer, greener, more equal world. What we actually do is help organizations set their visions, create strategies, turn those strategies into action. We fundraise and campaign, and hopefully we win. And we work with a really diverse group of organizations, from Refuge, Stonewall Mermaids, Anti-Slavery International, Plan UK, Peace Direct, to develop strategies. And there are others, of course. Could we move to the next slide, please? In terms of why we partnered, I just wanted to take a few minutes before handing off to the M+R team to take you through the data to talk about why we were so determined to bring the M+R digital benchmark study to the UK for the first time. I think it's a kind of common problem in the UK, but whenever we've started digging into the details of a client's digital ecosystem, we always come across the same or very similar problems, and that problem being that there's a sector-wide lack of understanding of what good looks like, or what we should be setting as our kind of key benchmark in order to judge our own performance. So what should a good email open rate be? How much should it cost to get an email subscriber? What is good Facebook engagement? And how many, and what's a good return on our digital ad spend? So in the absence of accurate data, we see myths build up, opinions rather than facts take hold, and in sometimes we've seen poor performance being accepted as the norm, and in some terrible situations being presented as success. So we've always looked across the pond at the M+R study. It's wide-ranging, comprehensive, really, really useful. But I think there's always been a nagging doubt amongst those in the UK that use it, that about using US data to drive UK programs. So obviously, really, really, really delighted when M+R said that they would partner to make it happen in the UK to give charities the sectors, to give charities the data here. So I'm now, with that kind of introduction, I'm going to hand back to Teresa, who will take you through the results.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So before we dive into data, I do want to take another second just to thank all the participants who many I'm sure are on the call today, who answered questions, provided data for the study. We know it can take a lot, and especially in the first year, it's definitely a new endeavor to pull a lot of the data that we ask for. These organizations do amazing work all year round, and their willingness to join is also just so generous. So we had 55 UK-based nonprofits participate this year. These groups were also included in the global report. Here you can see a breakdown of the UK groups by sector. And as we go through the charts, you'll see the data is often broken out along these sector lines. Sometimes a sector will disappear from a chart. When that happens, it's often because we didn't have enough data from enough participants to give a reliable average. So if you find that keeps happening in your sector, the best thing you can do is participate and encourage peers in your sector to do the same. The more participants we have, the more we're able to consistently provide reliable data. And if you're not sure where you land, you can always refer back to this list of participants on the website. And I think that's generally, I think the first place to go when you feel like it's the overall number isn't quite capturing the nuance in your sector. Just a quick couple of points on the data we're about to go over. When we talk about average, we mean median. We use median to help control for some of the outliers that might happen. There's a lot of different organizations here, so things kind of could be skewed either way if we didn't use median. In addition to sector, we sort participants by size, and that's defined here. It's by online revenue, amount of online revenue in a year. Sector is just a reminder of what we looked at the previous slide. We do ask groups to self-identify by sector because we know that some missions sort of overlap multiple sectors, and so it's important we want to make sure they're identifying what they think that's the most important sector for them. And as a special note for this study and what you'll see on some of the slides, where we compare to US organizations, we're comparing to only US groups. Not the metrics that we calculated for the global benchmark study that we launched a couple months ago. So the overall metrics that are included here the metrics in that study include everyone in that study, including the 55 UK groups who are in the study. So the US numbers you'll see here will mostly not line up with what you may have seen in that if you looked at that already. I know that we're going to go through a lot of data here today, and it can definitely take time to absorb charts, and some of them we won't be on very long. So everything we talk about today and much more is in the full report, and I definitely encourage you to go there if you haven't already been to the site to see it. Now on to the data. So here is kind of the biggest headline of the year, and I'll let you all sit with this for a moment. So online revenue grew by 35% for UK groups in 2020. Before I kind of jump into that, and I'll let you sit with the number for a second, let me just define online revenue. So we ask groups for online revenue, we ask them to exclude things like events, tickets that aren't like access to a site, or membership that isn't access to a site, major donors, grants, and things like that. So foundation gifts and things like that. So online revenue is sort of anything that's sort of like direct marketing online is what we're including in this. So back to that number, that 35% growth. I know that when we first saw this, after of course going back to confirm all the numbers, because this is such a big number, we were really moved. Like for me, there's nothing like a good happy cry about a chart. I'm a data analyst after all. But this is really so much more growth than we usually see year over year. For instance, in last year's Global Benchmarks report, we saw 10% growth from 2018 to 2019. We thought that was phenomenal, and we thought that was really good growth. So 35% is kind of shocking for us. And now I'll give my evergreen warning, although I just did it. We should never ever compare benchmarks reports to previous years or benchmarks reports, this one to the global one, because these are all different participants every year. So when we're talking about things that are year on year change, we're comparing the data that was submitted this year just for this cohort of participants. So we do think, of course, most of this growth was likely related to COVID. And to me, this means that people really, really stepped up to support charities across lots of different sectors in a really hard year. And then looking further into the numbers by sector, groups who focused on alleviating hunger and poverty saw an increase of 88% from 2019. So that is just huge growth within a sector. and much larger than that 35% overall growth that we already talked about. Again, this gives me a lot of hope that when donors see a need in their communities, they're really willing to support nonprofits who help people get what they need during really trying times. And that growth in online revenue seems to be driven by more people giving rather than people giving more. So the average cash gift declined from 55 pounds to 49 pounds, while the average regular gift grew slightly from 9 pounds to 10 pounds. So it seems that the main factor behind the growth in revenue is that UK nonprofits received 27% more gifts in 2020 than they did in 2019. So we'll dig into that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So this shows us what share of revenue came from regular giving in 2019 and in 2020. For UK groups, you can see that the regular giving made up 42% of revenue in 2019 and 30% of revenue in 2020. And the US comparison here really points to what we see as one of the biggest differences that's built up over the years. Regular monthly donations tend to be a much larger share of overall revenue for UK groups than they are for nonprofits in the US. And there are, of course, many reasons for this, a lot having to do with nonprofit strategy and to donor preference. Okay, so to recap those last couple of slides, growth in online revenue seem to be driven by more people giving rather than people giving more. And UK groups tend to have a larger share of revenue from regular giving than US groups. So to me, that shows that there's a lot of opportunity to grow cash giving for UK groups. And you can see here that happened. Revenue from cash giving increased by 65% in 2020. Don't get me wrong, regular giving also increased by a lot, by 22%. And in any other year, that would be astounding growth. And it is astounding growth. But the cash giving increase of 65% is definitely substantial. So it seems like the pandemic forced organizations to shift strategies and resources, and some of those shifts meant an increase in cash giving. So there were fewer in-person events and face-to-face fundraising. Organizations increased all types of digital efforts, and that might have helped boost the cash giving through these digital efforts. But we think the strategy and tactics part that was organization-led, that's probably just part of it. Supporters themselves also chose to make their impact through immediate cash giving. So it's possible that this growth shows an overall shift in donor preference and that we might see increases in cash giving outstrip gains in regular giving in an ongoing way. But we'll just have to see what happens. Again, converting all those 2020 cash donors requires a commitment to retention. And of course, retention should always be a priority for fundraising programs of any type at any time, but it's definitely especially important. I'm sure people are seeing that already this year. I know that for a lot of our clients, that's one of the biggest challenges is retaining a lot of new people who came in different types of sort of emergency giving in 2020. But we'll just kind of have to see what happens. And I think that's probably going to be the most important thing to focus on as far as this type of fundraising and this influx of cash giving in the next year. Okay. With that, I am going to turn it over to Matt to talk about digital ads.
Excellent. Hi, I'm Matt Derby at M+R, and I help lead our advertising area. So one of the things that I've been really excited to do a few years ago was to start introducing ads benchmarks data into our report, which we haven't always had. And so really happy to be able to include those in the UK debut. And here we'll dig in a little bit on the details in the next few slides, but I think the summary is that we've seen, along with revenue, increases in investment in ads compared to 2019 by a pretty significant margin. I thought it was interesting that the amount, if you judge a charity's ad spend based on online revenue, so how much of your revenue do you take and then reinvest into advertising? It's pretty similar actually to what we're seeing in the US and in terms of a factor of revenue. So about 12p for every pound raised. And we also saw pretty similar spending by goals. In the with about half of all ad spending being spent on direct fundraising, and the remaining split pretty evenly between lead gen and awareness. Although we'll see that that varies a little bit by the size of the organization. And then, in terms of ad spend, we sort of saw what we might expect from search and social. We saw pretty low, low relative returns on both display and video comparatively, which we'll get into a little bit. Probably does have to do with either the media landscape or the accounting method being used to judge ads in the United Kingdom comparatively. So if we want to jump into the next slide, like I mentioned, there's a pretty big increase in ad spending across the board for groups between 2019 and 2020. In fact, it outpaced what we saw in the United States. Well, we saw a pretty big variance by size and sector. So, health organizations and wildlife organizations saw by far the largest increase. The overall trend was relatively consistent. So definitely seems like this is a growing area of investment and attention for organizations. All right, and again, like I mentioned, most of that ad spending goes towards direct fundraising, followed by lead generation. So direct fundraising, asking for a gift directly, compared to with lead generation, which is finding new email or mobile numbers to add to your list, which in many cases, right, is also done with fundraising in mind, but sometimes as the conversion mechanism is then converting on email or on mobile on text. Branding and education ads made up just 12% of overall budgets, and as we have seen in the US, like large organizations tend to focus more on direct fundraising than medium or small groups. You see this, in fact, a little bit more clearly here, right? Medium groups definitely spend as much on lead gen as they do on direct fundraising, and small groups spend about half of what they're spending on something that they categorize as other, so entirely other. We've seen in the US that small groups tend to spend a lot on branding or awareness or education ads, in fact, and so we do tend to see more of a size difference than sector to sector changes. When we break down the amount of budget being spent on fundraising, most of that budget is being spent on search and social. And interestingly, this is where we actually started seeing a big discrepancy with what we saw in the US market. So if you want to go to the next slide. Among large nonprofits, most of that was being spent, especially on search and social, but there is a pretty big spend on display in the United States, about double what UK organizations are spending on display. And it's pretty much the same story for medium organizations as well. You see a little bit of a shift back in small organizations, but when we look at the return report on the next slide, you can probably see why this is the case, right? When we were looking at how organizations were reporting the value of the ad spend, return on ad spend and cost per donation. So these are pretty similar return metrics, but they're just sort of like the inverse each other, right? So return on ad spend is for every dollar you spend, how much do you make, because compared to how much do you pay for a donation. In terms of both metrics, search and social are by far look like the places to invest because you're making the most return, whereas display and video are much more costly to find a donation there, much lower return on ad spend. What we generally see is that, everywhere we know that display ads don't work the same way that search and social do, where you click on the ad, it takes you to a donation page and you can track that donation through URL tracking. People don't click on banner ads. If that's, in case that's, I don't click on it, nobody clicks on it. Maybe bots do. But so what that means is, the only way to sort of assess banner ads is if you're doing view through tracking, so more advanced tracking. There are, I think, some probably organizations who that does not necessarily fit with how accounting happens. If the rest of your efforts are tracked through click tracking, then it makes it really difficult to assess something in a different way. It also might have to do with GDPR and the function of that making view through tracking more difficult, because of it being future visits. So that may be one place where we're starting to see a big impact on the market actually having a shift in the benchmarks. All right, I'm going to send things back to Teresa for email. It looks like Teresa muted herself, and so I was going to have to request to be unmuted.
Okay, sorry about that. You'd think this many months into virtual everything, I would know how to operate all Zoom things. So yes, let's talk about email headlines. You've had a minute now to digest the text on this slide, but I'll just quickly go through some of this. So most email metrics improved in 2020. Email list sizes increased by 38%. Email revenue was 5% of online revenue for UK organizations in 2020. And email volume for UK organizations, how many messages are being sent, increased by 45%, but it was still far lower than email volume for US nonprofits. So those are the headlines. Before I dive into all the detail on the email data in the next few slides, I do want to frame everything I'm about to say. We think there's massive untapped potential in email in the UK. Now, generally, we don't like to give advice in benchmarks, data people. So we try to limit ourselves to what has happened rather than what should happen. We're also definitely self-conscious for this report about our very American perspective and about the long American history of trying to make everyone else do things the way we like to do them. But we think UK groups should be sending more email. And that isn't just coming from M+R. Our friends at Rally have also been advocating for this for quite some time. And the numbers really show it. And we'll walk through everything on the next few slides. So like I said, overall, most email metrics really improved in 2020. Open rates, click-through rates, response rates, page completion rates. I know there's a lot of very small numbers on this chart. The website is probably easier to see here, and there's additional breakouts by sector. The average response rate for advocacy emails was 5.9%, and the average response rate for fundraising emails was 0.63%, and that was up 3% from 2019. Now, in almost every benchmarks report we've ever reported on for the Global Benchmarks Report, email rates decline year over year. We've always thought that email was sort of declining over time, but not in 2020. We saw email growth across the board, or email rates grow across the board from 2019. Now, this might be because of higher levels of engagement from supporters. People were in front of their computers more often. They were in emotionally charged states. They send an email asking for support, and they're just more likely to give. It's also probably because of better targeting and better list hygiene by nonprofits. So let's look at the health of those email lists. So last year, email lists grew by an average of 38%. Again, one of these is kind of astounding growth numbers, building on 11% growth from the previous year. This was probably fueled in part by investments in digital ads for lead gen, like Matt just discussed. But this is very robust email list growth and much higher than what was reported for US nonprofits, who saw just 3% growth in 2020. So many more people joined email lists. List churn was also low. I don't have the chart here, but you can see on the site, list churn was also low. And those subscribers were quite receptive to the email content the organization sent. And this is all, of course, thanks to the efforts of nonprofit staff and commitment of supporters. We also think the restrictions of GDPR have really forced organizations to build healthy, engaged email audiences. And although we aren't under the same restrictions for GDPR, at least not everywhere in the States, we definitely have found that a lot of those things that maintain healthy lists and keep people engaged really do help with list health and with email performance. So lists are growing, metrics are really good, but just 5% of online revenue for UK organizations was sourced to email in 2020. The same proportion as in 2019, and this is compared to 20% of revenue from email in US nonprofits in 2020. There are many factors contributing to this, of course. Email programs are run differently. Supporter audiences might have different expectations. And other efforts like digital advertising, mobile messaging, social media, and regular giving are prioritized in different ways than they are for US groups. But probably the single most important factor, and the one which individual organizations have the most control over, is email volume. Now, email volume for UK groups did increase by a lot in 2020. So people are already sort of starting to hear this message about send more emails. Increased by 45%. And we'll see on the next slide that even though it increased that much, the volume is still far lower than it was for US nonprofits. So you can see US nonprofits sent far more emails in 2020. On average, UK groups sent a total of 28 messages across these 4 categories over the whole year. But if you were on an email list in the US, you'd be getting 29 fundraising messages alone. So again, to recap, lists look strong and they improved. Lists grew and remained healthy. Email revenue was up from 2019, but it still only made up 5% of online revenue. And that's compared to a much, much higher share for US nonprofits. So despite all that growth in volume, there's definitely still room to grow. So we do think UK groups should send more email. That's really all I have for email. There's definitely a lot more information and kind of more breakouts on the site if you want to see that. And you'll also see kind of this similar advice there. But yeah, that's what we have for that. All right, next we're going to go to social media, and I'm going to turn it back to Matt.
Excellent. So, yeah, I think the potential reach, obviously, of social media is really enormous, and I think one thing that stands out is, for UK charities, on average, they had more Facebook fans than email addresses. And again, some of that might be a function of ongoing GDPR impact on email addresses that didn't have the same impact on Facebook followers. But it is, right, still a large and platform for and continuing to grow. Obviously, simply having a large potential audience is not the same thing as actually reaching those supporters or engaging those supporters with content. So unlike email or SMS, social media platforms control the reach of each piece of content through algorithms, whether that's, and then supplement those with paid options as well. So, we saw that an organic post generally reaches only 7% of a charity's fans as of last year. So that means, right, 93% of your fans don't see any individual post that you put up. On the other side, 30% of the audience that do see a post were not fans before. So there is a mix of benefits of being able to reach not just your own fans, but also people who aren't already engaged with you. In order to expand that reach, right, we supplement that with paid promotion, and we did see that around 3% of nonprofit Facebook posts in the UK had a paid reach as well. So obviously, right, it's not just an information channel, it's a direct response channel as well. We want the audience to do something with that content. So we also took a look at how many users engage with each post on average. We'll get into this when we look at this, but the Twitter engagement is measured a little bit differently than Facebook engagement based on how those platforms report on it. And then we also have Facebook fundraiser information direct from organizations. So again, this is not just as a clarification, this is fundraising through the Facebook fundraiser specific platform. So donations made directly through Facebook, not necessarily Facebook driven donations that were made on your own website. So when we, if we want to look in at list sizes first, so for every 1,000 email subscribers, groups had 1,450 Facebook fans, somewhere around half of that in terms of Twitter followers and half again of Instagram followers. I think overall these probably reflect the size of those platforms and relative maturity of those channels. Facebook has been around for longer, so you have the most followers there, but it's also growing at a slower rate. I thought that, again, it was interesting that by and large, in the UK, audiences are following on social media more relative to email as compared to the US counterparts. And wildlife, what we see elsewhere, right, is wildlife and animal welfare groups have the largest Facebook and Instagram audience sizes relative to email size. I don't think that's too surprising given that they have like cuddly animals to be able to post pictures of. That always helps in getting followers.
Matt, we had a quick question in the chat that I just wanted
Sure.
to answer quickly on here because I think it's easier. Someone asked why we're comparing email addresses to social followers. Mostly we just need some basis of comparison. And email kind of existed first, so that became our baseline for a lot of this. So we realized that it could be compared to anything, but it's sort of hard to pick something that is as universal as email list size, just to show the relative difference in channels.
Great. Yeah, and like I said, right, we only reach a limited number of people for every post, especially organically. So the trend has been that this number, while we're not reporting on this in terms of, like Teresa would say, you never compare two different reports to each other, but it does seem like those numbers going down there year over year. Insert comment about Facebook here. And so, right, like we're continuing to see that there's a difference between what you can get out of an organic post versus what you're seeing in paid. I will say that I also think it's interesting that while the UK has more followers in terms of comparatively to the US, you're also seeing higher reach and higher paid reach as well. I think it is also natural that, right, like wildlife and animal welfare, they're able to rely on cute, cuddly animals. They don't have to pay to promote as many of their posts, especially if you compare to say disaster international aid organizations who are probably likely either trying to get their word out about fundraising. Okay, so because of Facebook's tendency to limit post reach based on their internal numbers, Facebook engagement rates can be really all over the place, and their internal engagement rates, how they define it, I think are a little less useful to use as a benchmark. So we try to look at a more stable figure, which is the number of users who interact with a post as a percentage of how many fans you have the day that that's posted. So it is sort of like, if you had 100 people, if you had 100 fans that day, and one of those people interacted with a specific post, you got a 1% engagement score. So this number ends up being pretty low, as you can tell. But let's say you had 100,000 fans and you post a piece of content, you sort of on average would expect 350 likes, clicks, or shares. You can also, again, see how you can see real variation in sectors. Interestingly, likely, right, this is probably a little bit related to how much each sector puts into its organic it's our organic social content, but also probably related to what's happening in 2020. It's hard to separate any of the news from how that performs on social media. So likely a factor also of Facebook's algorithms, because again, how much control that they have over who sees and then engages with a nonprofit's content. We did take a look at this both by media type and by day of the week, trying to better assess the kinds of content most likely to drive engagement and what kind of changes that you can have control over. We saw some differences. Weekends, especially Sunday, saw a little less engagement, and in general, the pivot to video drives a little bit more engagement. How much of that is algorithm derived versus actual user interaction, I think is probably a fair question, but by and large, there was no real major takeaways. Nothing like avoid posting on this day or make sure you're only posting this type of content. And likely, right, you should probably post the type of media that fits whatever you're posting about. When we look at Twitter engagement rate, this is different, right? Because Twitter actually provides a direct report of engagement, which is engagements as proposed divided by that post's reach. So we're going to see slightly higher because it's not based on your total number of followers. It's divided by how many people actually reached. So in 2020, the average engagement rate for Twitter was 2.2%. Again, we see some variation, especially with wildlife and animal nonprofit charities as being a high outlier in terms of engagement. So, but as you can see, almost every sector was sort of in the middle 50% in terms of where they landed in averages. So no real, nobody really far outside the normal range. When we think about engagement, of course, we also think about fundraising. So taking a look at Facebook fundraisers specifically. So fundraisers as the platform that lives on Facebook, especially the peer-to-peer version where people can set up their own fundraisers and ask their friends to make donations to a cause that they care about. We did see for the groups that we had year-over-year data for that this was relatively flat in the UK. We saw a little bit of an increase in the US. I will say we see, as you can tell here, based on sectors, for one, right, the international aid sector and disaster sector saw a huge increase, and that's kind of incredible, right? Like because that can't just be driven by either nonprofit strategy or by what Facebook is doing, but that's really the effort of individual supporters asking people to join them in a cause they care about, and likely reflects the fact that people saw a need in 2020 and decided to step up. That said, I will say that we do see these numbers, have seen them for the last couple of years fluctuate a bit, especially by sector and by individual organizations can see big jumps all of a sudden. For one, Facebook has a lot of control over this channel. They control it entirely. So what they provide, whether they, if they add an organization as a default option, for example, has made a huge difference in the past. But we also see that the effort that organizations put into these fundraisers can also have a huge impact on driving growth. And we can actually see this in the next chart, right? Like for one, sectors saw a really big difference in how much of their overall revenue came from Facebook fundraisers. For the health sector, is more than 5% of online revenue came from Facebook fundraisers. And it was almost that for hunger and poverty organizations. But you can also see on this chart, right, not just which causes earn support, but when, right? So some sectors saw spikes in fundraisers at different times of the year. For example, hunger and poverty fundraisers saw a spike in April just as the pandemic was coming around, which is likely related. But for most sectors, they saw December become a particularly busy time for Facebook fundraisers. Now in the US, we're pretty used to that because the tax holidays in December. And so, if you compare this, for example, to when most emails go out, it's pretty similar. We see most emails in the US go out in December as well. But we didn't see that in the United Kingdom. So, so this is clearly a decision by organizations to run holiday-based campaigns on Facebook fundraisers in December that clearly drove a lot of revenue in a way that is probably supplementary to what you're seeing online everywhere. So definitely something that, even though as a channel it's a little bit more in Facebook's control, is something that groups can have a lot of their own control over and efficacy over. All right. Speaking of which, finally, we did want to just touch on main donation page rates. So, this was another thing that we saw that varied a lot according to sector. And that's, not necessarily something that you're going to is a one-to-one correlation with anything. There are obviously differences in type of traffic and user intent for websites, especially if you're talking about the difference between health or international aid organizations or wildlife organizations. But we did want to point it out because it probably provides, indicates an opportunity for at least some groups, and certainly is a place where, a small change can make, or, depending on the volume of website visitors you're seeing, can make a huge difference. Excellent. All right, I think we're going to shift into questions.
I think Teresa's muted herself again. Teresa, sorry.
There we go. Sorry about that. I had a dog making a lot of noise in the background for a minute. A couple quick notes also before we get to questions. Again, we want to thank Rally for partnering with us on the study. And for those participants who joined us today, again, thank you for being a part of Benchmarks. You'll be receiving individual reports in the next few weeks. And for those of you who are suddenly jealous of the participating nonprofits who are receiving those individual reports, we'd love to have you join us next time. You can let us know you're interested at mrbenchmarks.com. There's a sign up for next year link in the navigation menu. Again, we definitely have some time for questions. We actually have until, we have about 45 minutes for questions. We probably won't take the whole time. We'll let people go as they need, but definitely feel free to jump in. And we have some questions that were already asked in the chat that we can start to address.
You'll start backwards if it's more recent.
Sure.
I saw there was, the massive increase in revenue for the international aid sector, right? Whether that's down to specific pushes or starting from a low base mark. I mean, I do think, again, we did see that compared to other sectors, the disaster and international aid organizations did have a smaller portion of their revenue coming from Facebook fundraisers, especially when compared to the health sector or the hunger poverty sector. So likely some of that increase is down to the starting point. I would say, again, I don't have any anecdotal information, but that much of an increase is probably both down to the news world situation and probably based on the effort of actual organizations to run Facebook fundraisers and their own changes.
Also, another question on social media was, have we looked at TikTok? We haven't, mostly because the reporting metrics aren't quite there and we don't know how many nonprofits are sort of there. We might look into that in the future. In fact, we're kind of always keeping an eye on which channels are growing. We, in fact, would love to be able to report on more Instagram metrics, but they don't really have the same kind of reporting that we can get from other sort of Facebook channels. Let's see. I'm going to go back to a couple of the fundraising questions, if that works. I think we kind of addressed some of them as I went through the slides, but just in case I didn't. One of the questions was, is the shrink in regular giving because more cash gifts were made rather than less regular giving? We did see increases in both, and we did see average gift increase. So I think I wouldn't say there was a shrink in regular giving. I think there was an increase in both of them. It's just cash grew at a faster rate last year and became a larger share than it had been previously. And then similarly, how much of this is because people gave more generally and how much is because charities were investing more in relation to growth of cash? I mean, it's probably both. We did see big growth in digital ad spend, so that definitely contributed to it. But we also saw in the global benchmarks report that there was a lot of additional organic traffic and things like that. So people were motivated to do this on their own as well. It was kind of all sides. We think people were moving things offline and coming online to do a lot of this work, and we think the news just kept kind of pointing them back to giving to nonprofits to help out.
And I wouldn't mind just spending a few moments talking about Tom Baker's question, because I know that attracted some interest in chat. I think it was a fascinating output of the data, Tom, and others who were talking about it in terms of the number of advocacy emails that declined. And it's very difficult to make a comment on it from the data that we have and the data that we're looking at. But I think anecdotally, from just existing in and around the UK sector campaign groups, it felt to me that fewer organizations were at the beginning of the pandemic, especially fewer organizations were keen to promote their campaigns because of this concept of not feeling that it was their time. Like I say, the data doesn't support that, but it's a conversation I had with a number of groups who did not at the beginning of the pandemic necessarily want to kind of talk about non-pandemic related things, and that might be one of the contributing factors.
Let's see another email question about can you recommend some tips for maintaining good email list hygiene? Well, there's a lot that can be there. I think the biggest things are making sure that folks can opt out when they want, so that the emails that you're sending aren't going to people who are reporting you as spam or who don't want to receive your emails anymore. So making sure that unsubscribe is easy and making sure you're honoring opt-out requests and things very easily. I mean, lots of other things. Making sure you're getting good names to begin with is always helpful, and which I think GDPR does kind of force a lot of these good practices. And then I think it's also making sure you have a pretty robust way of suppressing inactive people. So deciding what period of time you will stop sending to donors, what period of time you'll stop sending to people who haven't opened a message or clicked a message. And people define that in lots of different ways, but I think those are kind of the biggest things that we do, and mostly just keeping an eye on all the metrics regularly and seeing if things are happening with particular email domains or with particular messages to make sure that you're not messing up your list.
Great. I know there was a quick question from Yvonne about the advocacy email response rate referring to conversion completed actions. Yes, so the email advocacy response rate is a completed petition out of total emails sent.
I just wanted to add one quick note. For what we include in advocacy messages here, we also are only talking about full file messages that are for online petitions. So this isn't like a targeted message that becomes an offline ask or something like that. This is really just for things that are trackable online and that go to either a random audience or the full audience and not just some specific subset.
Great. And I saw one from Kim. So what impact do you think iOS 14 event tracking changes will have on 2020 versus 2021 paid Facebook results? That's an excellent question. The first answer I give is I don't know, because I think I don't. If anyone has any degree of certainty about what different tracking changes will have on the sector overall, then yeah, you should listen to them, or don't listen to them because they might just be wrong. I actually would say I would assume this year in particular that most of the changes you're going to see are continued movement towards the channels that have better tracking. So actually, I would say more investment, especially in the US, in search and social, because you can use click tracking and that's not being impacted as much, especially source codes aren't really being impacted as much by various cookie tracking. So I think the short term might be a small drop in investment in, for instance, display and video as we figure out how the ad reporting ecosystem works again. There's some adjustment to that. That is what I would guess. I think you could see if tracking is really messed up for Facebook, perhaps you see some drop in Facebook results reported and therefore drop in investment. However, again, I think right now what you're seeing is most organizations aren't really using cookies to report out on these, because if they were, then we'd be seeing a lot more revenue being reported to display. So likely, especially when you look at the UK numbers, I think there may not be that much of a shift. Maybe controversial.
I see a question. Did you look at conversions to single gift from lead gen or conversions from single gift giving to regular giving? We did not this time. It's also kind of difficult. It could be difficult to track, and definitely varies on how organizations track it. So it's a harder one to benchmark. It's something we look at for clients because it definitely varies by organization.
Yeah, and in order to avoid getting into GDPR rules, we didn't ask for any individual conversion data from anybody, which we do actually look at for like retention numbers from US orgs. So that also adds to how difficult that is to pull.
Mm-hmm. This question I kind of want to open up to everyone if we can get more opinions on it, but what do you think was the most surprising thing from the data? I mean, I touched on it, but this was for both the global report and for the UK report. I was legitimately emotional when I saw the growth in online revenue in 2020. Like, I just had assumed it would hopefully be flat, or like from what we'd seen, I assumed it would vary a lot by sector. But for there to be growth across so many sectors and for it to be such substantial growth, it's like really moving to me that people are doing this. And I think it's going to, I'm really interested to see what the 2021 numbers will show us. But I was just really encouraged and like felt very good about the world when I saw that many more people were supporting groups in this way.
I'm going to take that one as well. The online revenue growth absolutely was incredible. The real nerd in me, the real kind of person who likes getting into the weeds with this stuff, I was very surprised at the variance in donation page conversion rates across different charities. For a long time, been thinking that maybe in the UK we don't necessarily pay enough attention to that part of the process. Got lots of direct mail expertise in the UK where people agonize over forms, but it doesn't seem like we've given it the same attention in the UK as in the US. And the data and that really wide variance of conversion rates by different organizations really struck me as, I wouldn't say evidence, because it depends on where the traffic is coming from, of course, but it struck me as something that we could all take away and look to improve on. Sorry, Matt, I spoke over you.
No, that's great. I would say actually this can, the more I work in different sectors or around the different markets, I continue to generally, right, like the first thing I'll look for is where are there differences, and obviously we saw differences in when we pulled out the UK market as its own, but most of those, what I was surprised by was most of those differences were sort of like what we set ourselves up for, right, which is like differences in list size due to GDPR. People prefer regular giving more than people in the US do. And by and large, seeing, like Teresa said, just like actually the really big picture trends, which in 2020, I think was largely defined by how much people supported charities and nonprofits. That always surprises me for some reason. I think I don't prep myself as well for the things that are actually like commonality between people around the world. So that generally actually surprises me. And because it comes down to like little things, like we see, like wildlife organizations having more Instagram followers. Like, of course that's true everywhere, but it also, I don't know, it speaks to something deeper.
I'd love to see
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'd love to see in chat the things that surprised people on the call the most as well. That'd be a really great thing just to get a sense of.
I also would just encourage everyone to keep an eye on the chat, because there's really good discussion happening related to some of the things we're talking about, if you're not already looking there. I also saw a question about, will the presentation be shared with attendees after the call? And it will be. We'll share that recording, which will include this Q&A. We'll share that afterward.
Cool. There's a question from Matt Sherrington. Reflections in our urging for the UK to email more, or any difference between UK and US. There's a clear difference between the UK and US in terms of some of the regulations, and it's an opinion. I think we should be looking at the US. I agree with the M+R position that we should be emailing more. We should be data led. We should be looking at the data all the times, and we should probably not email in the same way that Mr. Trump emailed in the US, but we should be emailing more and keeping an idea on the keeping a good look at the key metrics to see where we can lead us, because it looks to me like there is a short-term, not even short-term, there is an increase in revenue that can be found there by emailing people a few more.
Yeah, maybe the better is like email more to people who want you to email them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I see Lucy Scanlon just said in the chat, email better, not just more, but yes, we think like the lists are already good, the metrics are improving, keep doing those things, but also send some more emails.
Yeah, and I think you see in the US organizations who are doing the kind of data, pruning that GDPR forced European organizations to do, because the metrics make you do that if you're sending to too many people who don't want to hear from you or aren't real.
Yeah, definitely. Email better. My goodness me, I should have said that. I have a campaign. I'm launching a campaign to eradicate the UK charity newsletter, where we ask for 12 things in one email, so that we only ask for maybe one thing in each email. But that's for another webinar. Yeah,
I will say we wouldn't encourage more newsletters. We did see in the global report that public media groups in the US were sending 54 newsletters a year, which feels like too many to me. They obviously have a different point for newsletters, but I remember seeing that number and being kind of, I guess, relieved that I wasn't on a lot of public media email lists. Let's see. So the UK sector shows us what the status quo is in the UK sector, or sorry, the data shows us what's the status quo in the UK sector, not what best practices or what we should be aiming for. Does the report focus on the best performing groups or what we can learn from them, or do you have any reflections on that? That is like the million-pound question for benchmarks, is like, what is driving the best performing organizations within the study? We don't look at that, or we didn't this year. We have in previous years. I think we really just we report the medians, and report out like in some cases, the range, just so that you're able to see sort of like what the baseline number is. And if you're doing much better than that, great. If you're not quite there yet, pay attention to what some of those sectors, some of the participants in those sectors to see what might be driving them. But yeah, it's hard to always point to exactly what's driving these changes. We did take some guesses. Not sure if Matt or Paul, if you have any other thoughts on that. This is always like the toughest thing to answer, I think, with benchmarks, because we're tempted to kind of jump to a lot.
Yeah, especially since like that's in our normal day-to-day lives, what our job is, right? But I do think we set out to have benchmarks be just the data as much as possible. And I think like trying to, while we do try to pull out takeaways and look at, like what we think explains the trends, I think it's really difficult to try to take too much away in terms of prescriptions for what an organization should do, especially independent of how your own performance and context is. Like I will say, if you, to Paul's point, if you look at what your own main donation page conversion rate is, and it's way lower than what everybody else is saying, yeah, that's probably like, you should probably go like, I don't know, pick a sector that's performing well and look at some of their donation pages and see like, is there something we can test? But by and large, I don't know that we could. It would be like probably a fool's errand to try to like say like, here are the shining children, because usually it's going to be, I know in 2008, right? It was like, if you had Barack Obama on your donation page, that was how to raise a lot of money. So like, good if you can do that, but there's always going to be context that you can't necessarily apply to every single organization.
Yeah, and I wouldn't, just adding to that, I mean, very relevant given the newsletter chat that's going on in the chat, which I'm finding very amusing. I think we've all agreed on our first action. I think the position on email in the UK, and this is again not driven by the data, but more of a view, is we kind of need to elevate its importance probably in our marketing plans. We saw huge growth in email list size. I think it was 38% was the number, but the income levels remain flat. So there's a real opportunity, I think, in some organizations to double down on the data and create the project at your own organization to see how you can improve your key metrics, your content, and it's all measurable by data. And I think a bit of it comes with a bit of investment, and a bit of it comes in kind of hiring in the right skills or working with the right people. But that isn't a plug, by the way, because I don't do email copywriting training. But there's plenty of ways to really focus on that, and there's some great work being done by UK groups to go and be inspired by.
I know there was a question around ad account restrictions on Facebook. If I have any tips to avoid this, I have, unfortunately, Jamal, I don't have great tips on how to avoid that. I think, especially for it seems really haphazard. Honestly, what counts as political in Facebook's worlds and what doesn't. I do think, right, like there was a question earlier about what's the impact that event tracking changes are going to have. I think likely the biggest impact on Facebook and where digital ads move in the future is probably how much Facebook and Google themselves continue to make it difficult for nonprofits and charities to justify spending money on their platforms. I think they provide an amazing opportunity. You can reach more people than ever before. I don't want to necessarily cede those platforms to bad actors, but yeah, we do see, especially for in the US, whether it's health rights or especially even what you would think would be relatively straightforward international aid organizations have had to go back and forth between registering as a political organization or not registering as a political organization. We get disapprovals every day on our ads on Facebook for something as innocuous as having the word refugee on a donation page. So that may have a huge impact. And I wish my honest best advice, if you are dealing with that, is just clone and relaunch everything over and over again. So that's not exactly a good next step, but it is very honestly what we do to try to deal with it.
Matt, I think related, there's another question in here that's, if you want to address that one.
Oh, sure. So Hannah says, for ethical reasons, we're finding it harder and harder to spend so much on Facebook ads. The audience on Facebook is leaning to older demographic as well. Do we predict the public moving away from Facebook in the next few years? And how would you advise a medium-sized charity to future-proof your digital fundraising? I think those are two questions, because I will say, interestingly, when I have looked at overall performance on Facebook, it's both older and younger. I think that probably changes by sector. Right now, if you look at the overall user base numbers, Facebook's like the number of people who use Facebook hasn't moved a lot. So will it in the next few years? Yeah, I mean, maybe not. However, again, even if it's a good option, I do think it's worth testing other channels and not over relying on one source that could at a moment's notice decide we're not going to allow any more political fundraising. Also, we define political fundraising as mentioning any word that we don't like. So, you know, we had a number of organizations here in the US who had to go and stop all spend on Facebook for a number of months around the election. And that's scary if you're spending somewhere between around, as we saw, 60% of your fundraising spend on a platform. So my best suggestion is always be testing other channels. You know, at least 20% of what you're spending, test something you haven't tried before, except that it might fail. But you know, I don't know. One, I don't know that YouTube or TikTok are ethically any better than Facebook. I also don't know that they will perform any better. But at the very least, try something and try to see what you can get out of other channels, so that you can find the thing that could work just as well before you have to.
Adding one thing to that, I think the data said that we've got some room to invest more in search. I think that would be an area that if I was looking to de-risk, or at least not be dependent on a single platform, is to really double down on your search, your paid search, and your use of the Google grant and how they work together.
I do think video is going to be where digital ad spend moves in the future. We got this really weird moment in time where you can buy ads that are streaming on someone's television, but you can't really tell what they do, because it's like the way you buy them is like buying a display ad, but most of the people who are buying them are still the old school TV people. And I don't know if you have the same thing, but if you stream TV here, you get like the same insurance company ad like 30 times for every episode that you watch, because it's just like this weird, it hasn't evolved yet into something that's useful. But I think that it will, and when that happens, I think you're going to see a really big shift, because you're talking about a captive audience, you're talking about an incredible reach. It's all the reasons why Facebook is a useful ads platform.
We do have about 15 more minutes left for questions if people have them. I did want to, we didn't have this question come up, but we have gotten it on previous webinars, and I think it's a good one. Do you all have any predictions for what to look for next year's benchmarks, or any predictions of what we will see? We are in July, so we do have a little bit of anecdotal data so far this year. I can start if you want. I think I already mentioned it when I talked about it, but I think like retention is going to be the most interesting thing for me to see where this cash giving and regular giving, where it's going. And I know we didn't have a lot of the information in this report because we didn't get the personally identifiable information, but for the global benchmarks, looking at our retention data and see if donors are staying, I think is going to be, it's the thing we're working on the most with a lot of our clients, and I think it'll be the most interesting thing to see for 2021.
Yeah, and I think if I was to make a prediction for 2021, I think very specific to the UK, I think we're going to see real growth in Facebook fundraisers, as the very specific to the UK at the moment focus on virtual challenge events really starts to take hold. Anecdotally, hearing some very large numbers from some household brands and getting a sense that there's a lot of investment going into that space in the UK. So I'm fully expecting there to be a big uptick in the presence of Facebook fundraisers as a percentage of overall charities' online revenue. Probably be proven wrong. Who knows? Predictions, eh, Matt?
2021. Oh man, I feel like that one's wrong. I would say, actually, if I were to predict, I think, especially compared to, we've seen at least 3 straight years of pretty significant increases in ad spend. I think that'll maybe stay even next year. I think just with the amount of uncertainty and starting, I think groups will start to see the pandemic fundraising revenue start to level off. And I think when revenue starts to level off, you start seeing ad spend start to level off.
Yeah, I will say, I know like for our report a few years ago, we had what looked like a really strange year of decline, but really it was just kind of a return to normal year, because 2017 we saw a huge increase in a lot of support because there was a Trump effect of people giving to lots of nonprofits to counteract what was happening nationally. So I predict also we will probably see a drop, just because how do you grow from 35% growth? Going on top of that is going to be tricky. So it's going to be interesting to looking at what we talk about next year, because it's all probably going to be more a return to normal, I hope. Yeah.
Amazing.
Matt, there's an ads question here too, if you want to. I don't know if you want to.
I just dropped this into the chat. Have you dug into the best performing lead gen ads and any common threads? I would say the thing that I've seen recently in terms of trends is that if what you really want with lead gen is to get people to donate, getting to the donation ask quickly is really important. I would also say, just in general, again, if you're trying to evaluate lead gen recruits on their conversion to fundraising, using the messaging and topic that you will be fundraising on in the lead gen ad might not get you the lowest cost per recruit, but it will get you the best return long term. So you can always try to optimize towards just like really low CPAs, but if you are messaging on one topic to recruit people to your list and then you don't actually talk about it at all, that tends to see a big drop off. And then, well, because I just saw it, big jumps in media costs on Facebook. Yes, as the ad industry overall, beyond outside of nonprofits, is returning to more normal spend levels, I think that's driving a media cost increase. And whether that will continue to rise, I think, is probably, unfortunately, down to like the overall economic situation.
Yeah, I see a question coming in from Elliot. Is there data around what's driven email lists by 38% because that's such a significant increase. I think we saw in the study that there was investment in lead gen advertising, and we could see that there was a big chunk of budgets for medium to small sized organizations going there. I think, but anecdotally, but the data didn't tell me this, but my presence in the sector does tell me this, is seeing lots and lots of UK groups starting to invest in email lead gen as part of their kind of hand raiser moments or online petition moments, or those different types of thing, as a way of growing their support, and seeing fundraising teams and advocacy teams and comms teams start to work together to present single sort of approaches. So we're seeing that happen in the UK. I also think it's a product of more people giving online, so more people giving their email addresses in the at the point of making their donation, and I'm seeing lots of charities spend time optimizing their permission statements to ensure that they're maximizing the number of people who donate, who give an email address at that point as well, to give future permission for contact. Cool.
There's another question here that I don't know if I have a good answer for, but I don't know if others on the panel do. Where would you suggest more coders should be done to reach the most politically powerless? It's not exact, but there's substantial read across from the UK to US groups here.
I think that's a really good question. I do think, and we are seeing in the US more organizations try to specifically set aside lead gen without the requirement that it has a return, so that it can so that those organizations can ensure that, right, like part of what they're doing is making sure that their supporter base is a diverse, especially from communities that are traditionally ignored, especially by nonprofits and charities. And I think probably that's that kind of intentional investment in diversification is the only real answer. Unfortunately, I think it has to, you have to start, like if you can't start it on that side, you can't, because you really have to start internally and work outwards. It's to be honest, like they're pretty easy ad options for if you want to, you know, recruit people of color, but there are not easy options if you then don't change anything about how your onboarding strategy works, or don't change anything about how your messaging works, or how your programs serve the community in ways that it needs to. Those are the really difficult questions.
I will say we recently at M+R put out a guide to ethical creative, which talks a bit about this and how to make sure you're not, you know, tokenizing your audience and causing more harm by just having a goal to recruit the list, or without a plan for actually how to use that data ethically. If people are looking for more thoughts there, this is hard.
I think in response to Alison's question as well, I think it comes from leadership within the organization, and a lot of what we've, in kind of recruiting participants to the study, I spend a lot of time talking to fundraising groups, fundraising leaders, or fundraising people within the sector to participate in the study, which is a kind of symptom of what how the UK sector operates. And I think in terms of organizational structures, if we want to reach all areas of the population or all areas of our community in terms of bringing around the change that we want to see, then there needs to be a willingness and a structure within the organization to have public facing activities which have fundraising objectives, as well as community organizing objectives as well as mobilization objectives, which I think at the moment in the UK it's more likely that campaigns and fundraising will be working to different budgets and targets. So it's about, I think, bringing all those things together and taking kind of a single approach to our public facing comms or engagement asks. And the M+R guide is amazing.
I see a quick question here about how many years going back do we have the data. For the UK groups, we asked, it depended. Some of the metrics we asked for 5 years of data. Some we asked for a couple years of data. It depends. We mostly always try to balance how much work we're asking organizations to do, because we know that people are already stretched for time. So we tried to go back a few years where we could, but mostly it's just year over year comparisons. I also see a question here about, it'd be interesting to see how many charities saw offline donors switch to online giving during the pandemic. They saw online response to offline direct marketing appeals grow a lot. I think that's definitely, that would be a very interesting point and definitely hard to capture, particularly with a study and particularly trying to not have personal information. This is a much harder thing to capture, but I do think, I'm sure that is part of the growth in online, is that people have just shifted channels.
Could we be done?
I think we may be. We also, of course, I could share my screen again, but you can always reach us at our websites or social media handles if you have more questions as you go through this. This was a very lively chat and question session. This was fun. I'm glad to be able to do this. And we're, again, really, really excited to have done the report and to have worked with Rally on this.
I'm the most excited I've ever been as a consequence of doing this with you guys. Thank you very much.
Great. So I think with that, we can let everyone go and give you back 5 minutes for your time.
Enjoy the football. Bye-bye.